Gilgamesh ana shashuma izakara ana Utnapishtim ruki. Ana tana kuma Utnapishti. Minatuka ulshana ki yati ma ata. Uata ulshanata ki yati ma ata. Gomor kalibi ana epesh tukunti. Ahinadat elutzerika. Ata ki tazizma in a puhur ili balata teshu. Utnapishtim ana shashuma izakara ana Gilgamesh. Lupteka Gilgamesh amat nitzerti uperishti sha ili kasha lukbika.
That was Stephanie Dalley, a research fellow at the Oriental Institute at Oxford and an expert in the Mesopotamian history as well as cuneiform. And of course, she's the one who wrote the book who required you to redact your own Epic of Gilgamesh rather than reading a simpler version like the translation by Stephen Mitchell. Well, that's not true. I made you read and redact your own version. But that's part of the skills we're practicing in this class. What she was reading was Tablet 11, which is by far the most famous tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we're going to back up a little bit before we get to that one and start with Tablet 6. This is where Ishtar and Enkidu have returned from defeating Humbaba. They've returned in victory. They've beat this previously thought unbeatable foe. But there's a bit of foreboding. There's a bit of dread, especially on Enkidu's part. He knows that he's sort of pushed a bit too far and that there may be some repercussions. They have inadvertently caught the eye of the goddess of love and, to some extent, the goddess of love and war, the goddess of all things fair, this sort of unpredictable but extremely powerful goddess named Ishtar, probably one of the most famous of the gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. She attempts to seduce Gilgamesh, but she's got a long history of lovers who didn't end up so well. And Gilgamesh is aware of this, and he immediately confronts her with that fact rather than giving in to her advances. And what follows is a list of what appears to just be a litany of insults. But actually, he gives us a lot of ideologies that would have made a lot more sense to people at the time than they might make to us today. References to the Ululu bird who, in his sorrow from his broken wing somehow caused by Ishtar, he out in the woods cries constantly, "My wing, my wing." Well, this is a story about how this particular bird came to make the particular call that it's known for. So it's a story about how a particular thing came to be. Remember, that's an ideology. She also caused the horse to be the subject of the whip, the goad, and the lash. In other words, to be domesticated and to be whipped in order to pull a cart. This is where the domestication of the horse comes from. He doesn't give us the whole story. He expects that we already know this, or the authors at the time that the Standard Babylonian Version was written, they expect that we already know this, but of course we don't. But we see enough to see that these are ideologies about how common phenomena in their world came to be. But of course, one does not simply rebuff and insult the goddess of love and war. And she's enraged by this insult. And Ishtar goes up to heaven and asks her father Anu, the king of the gods, to give her the bowl of heaven. Let me strike Gilgamesh down. Let me strike Gilgamesh in his dwelling. If you don't give me the bowl of heaven, I shall set my face towards the infernal regions. I shall raise up the dead, and they will eat the living. I shall make the dead outnumber the living. And in this, she's also connected to what may be her sister or what may be another version of herself. And that is the goddess Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. That image on the top left of the screen above me is a depiction probably of Ereshkigal. It's usually called the Queen of the Night. And some have labeled it as Ishtar herself. Some have called it Ereshkigal. But in this passage, it sounds like there's not a distinction between the two. It sounds like Ishtar has the power to go down and bring up the dead, to basically bring about an army of zombies. I shall raise up the dead, and they will eat the living. This is a very familiar schema to us, but of course we don't want to assume it's exactly the same as we conceive it. But it doesn't seem to be too far away. But he doesn't let her, or doesn't want to let her do this at first, and notice why. This is very important. He says, Anu says, "On no account should you request the bowl of heaven from me. There would be 7 years of chaff in the land of Uruk. You would gather chalk instead of gems. You would raise grass instead of something else, presumably crops." And she replies, "I have heaped up a store of grain in Uruk. I have ensured the production of something." And what this appears to hint at, imply, is that sending the bowl of heaven would cause too much destruction, not just to humans, but to their ability to raise crops. And if they don't have the ability to raise crops, there's the potential for another, complete starvation, a plague level disaster, the kind that we saw in Atrahasis. And there's specifically about the wheat, if there's no economic produce, then there's going to be no sacrifices. The importance of the sacrifices should be becoming more and more apparent, and we'll definitely get back to that in Book 11. And so she summons up, he agrees to her demand as long as there are these storehouses. These grain has been put aside to make up for whatever destruction the Bull of Heaven causes. So Anu relents, and the Bull of Heaven comes up. And it's ambiguous exactly what the Bull of Heaven is or is imagined to be, but we have images in art of sometimes an actual bull with the body and head of a bull. Sometimes it's one of these Lamassu, the name for these supernatural creatures that we frequently see decorating doorways in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities. But the way he's described, at the snorting of the Bull of Heaven, a chasm opened up. At the second snorting, another chasm opened up. The third snorting, a chasm opened up, and then the Bull of Heaven blew spittle in Enkidu's face, and with its thick tail whipped up its dung. It has been suggested that both he and Humbaba are sort of mythological representations of a past volcano. A volcano frequently never just happens alone. It happens with earthquakes. It happens, it throws up dust clouds into the atmosphere, and those dust clouds create lightning storms, create wind. If it's close to water, it could create a tsunami. So you have this sort of confluence of all these, the worst, sort of most awe-inspiring disaster or natural weather phenomenon. This has been suggested to be a sort of long-forgotten account that sort of survived in oral tradition. And the people that have written the most about this, if you're interested in this sort of thing, the history of mythology and the way to explain it with the way humans interpret the world beyond what they can understand, there's a book called When They Severed Earth from Sky by Elizabeth Wayland Barber and Paul T. Barber, which I'll just mention here for anyone who's interested. But for our purposes in the text, the bull is just a bull, this giant bull that is a property of the gods, but can cause this citywide destruction. And yet, Gilgamesh and Enkidu seem to make relatively short work of it. It's almost comical how quickly they sort of pull it apart, take it down, and then Ishtar is flabbergasted. She's amazed at how he's, and she's so angry she stamps the walls of Uruk. Again, potentially earthquake imagery. But whatever backstory or whatever background there was to that myth, it has merged with these tales of the gods and the tales of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And once it's destroyed, Enkidu doesn't just rest on his victory. He's so confident, so glorying in his achievement, that as Ishtar is shouting at them, he pulled out the Bull of Heaven's shoulder and slapped it into her face. In other words, he just pulls off the leg of the bull and throws it and hits Ishtar with it. Well, this is not going to go well for Enkidu in the future. Notice that on page 83, at the beginning of Tablet 7, Stephanie Dalley tells you that this about 20 lines have been replaced with a Hittite version. So there is a little bit of redaction being done within the Standard Babylonian version. We have this few lines of Hittite. And in these lines that follow, or the two tablets that follow, tablets 7 and 8, what you have is the introduction of the next real phase of conflict that these protagonists, well, mainly just Gilgamesh, have to undergo. but that both of them are going to have to deal with. Up to now, everything has gone their way. They fought with each other, they fought to a draw, and then they became friends. They fought with Humbaba. They were able to take on, one of the sort of scariest monsters in the world. When a goddess turned on them and sent this monster, the Bull of Heaven, they were still able to relatively easily deal with that. But now they're up against something that all humans have to deal with, and that is even the idea, the realization that they're not going to live forever, that they're going to die. And Enkidu has to deal with this first. He has a dream where all the gods are in assembly and they're talking about what has to be done. He knows that the gods are angry at him, or at least Ishtar is angry at him, and with Gilgamesh, and the other gods, however they feel about these two individuals, recognize that something has to be done. And they decide that it's going to be Enkidu that dies. And Enkidu sees all of this in a dream. He wakes up and he tells Gilgamesh about it, and he's clearly distraught. Enkidu is clearly distraught. Gilgamesh seems to be not so bothered by it. He's at first says, "Oh, you're being unreasonable. This dream could mean anything." And then he says, "Well, I'll mourn you, and everyone who knew you will mourn you, and all this." But it's still very sort of formulaic, very sort of, "Oh, here's what's going to be done for you." It's not the way he's going to mourn later, once Enkidu is actually dead. It doesn't seem it's actually sunk in what death means. And it's definitely sunk in for Enkidu. Enkidu curses everyone, curses civilization, wishes he'd never left the fields when he was this sort of wild animal man out in the fields with the gazelle and the bulls. He curses Shamhat, not to be confused with the god Shamash, but Shamhat is clearly a sacred prostitute, a temple prostitute in the temple of Shamash, because when Enkidu curses her and goes through this long curse saying, "I hope, all the different ways he wants her life to be miserable," Shamash, the god, in defense of Shamhat, the prostitute, says directly to Enkidu, "Why are you cursing my harlot Shamhat, who fed you on food fit for gods, gave you ale to drink, fit for kings, clothed you with a great robe, then provided you with Gilgamesh, a fine partner? And now Gilgamesh, the friend who is a brother to you, will lay you to rest on a great bed, and lay you to rest on a bed of loving care, and let you stay in a restful dwelling, the dwelling on the left," which seems to indicate, the place of death. And with that, Enkidu changes his curse, and he sort of recognizes and accepts what Shamash tells him, and says, "Come, Shamhat, I will change your fate." And then he goes on to describe his dream and what he saw in the underworld, what was waiting for him ahead. And this description of the underworld, keep in mind, because it's Enkidu that's dealing with the underworld and reporting it back, presumably to Gilgamesh. We're going to see this again in a different context, possibly a doublet. And then in Tablet 8, we have Gilgamesh saying to Enkidu how he's going to commemorate him after his death. And we're not told exactly how Enkidu dies. We have on page 90, he's, the third day and the fourth day, the illness grew worse. His flesh was weaker. But we have a gap of about 30 lines when the actual death occurs. So we don't actually see what happens. We do have Gilgamesh later refer back to what has happened and tell the people he comes across. He just held on to him until a maggot falls out of his nose. So he's been dead for so long, he's decomposing. But we don't get that yet. Instead, in Tablet 8, we get a long list. The entirety of Tablet 8 is dedicated to, apparently, the ritual process, the burial process, all that goes with the mourning, the funeral ritual, and all that accompanies Enkidu's death. And this is very important, maybe not to us. It doesn't really move the narrative forward, but we're going to see when we come back to Tablet 12 that this was a unique focus for many people in the Mesopotamian world. This is somewhere where they drew their ideas about what you're supposed to do in a funeral rite. But it's only with Tablet 9 on page 95 that it seems that the reality of death hits Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh says in the first column of Tablet 9, Gilgamesh mourned bitterly for Enkidu his friend and roamed an open country. Shall I die too? Am I not like Enkidu? Grief has entered my innermost being. I'm afraid of death, and so I roam an open country. And with this, it seems the final conflict, the really the defining conflict of the entire Epic of Gilgamesh is not one of these episodes. It's not Humbaba. It's not the Bull of Heaven. It's not even Ishtar. It's death itself that Gilgamesh is now finally confronted with. Despite all his heroism, despite all his strength, despite all his power, despite all his fame, this is something that he is just now having to confront, the very idea of. But he hasn't accepted it yet. He thinks, oh, this is just like another adventure. Just like I went off to beat Humbaba, just like I fought the Bull of Heaven, so too I can go on this quest and find a way out of death. And he knows of only one mortal or two mortals who have actually been given immortality, and that is Utnapishtim and his wife, the survivors of the flood, that we'll find out more about in Tablet 11. But he knows he has to go find them, and they're far away, so he goes off. He's roaming in open country at first, but he's now going off to this otherworldly realm in order to find Utnapishtim. And to get there, he first goes to this mountain of Mashu, where he meets these scorpion people who are put there to guard the mountain. They recognize it's Gilgamesh. They see that he's 2/3 divine, but when he approaches them and he tells them what he wants to do, they say, "Oh, what you're asking is impossible. Nobody has passed through the mountains." But if he wants to get to Utnapishtim, he has to go through this cave. And this cave is described as the path of Shamash. Remember that Shamash is the god of the sun. So the implication is this is that cave under which, it must be in the far west, and the sun goes down and then goes under the earth all the way to the east where it comes up again. That's not made explicitly clear, but this is the path of Shamash, and he seems to be going the opposite direction of the sun, which means he has to outrun the sun. He has to get there from one end of the cave to the other before the sun enters, otherwise he'll be killed. And again, another sort of supernatural feat. And this is clearly comes from an old song, because we get a refrain over and over again. He hurried on. The darkness was still dense. There was no light. It was impossible for him to see ahead or behind. And then when he achieved, the next league, he hurried. The darkness was still dense. There was no light. It was impossible for him to see ahead or behind. This is all on page 98. And notice, despite the fact there's so many areas in brackets, meaning that there's many breaks in the tablet, we still know what was there because it's a refrain. Luckily, this refrain has enough identifying words that we know how to fill in those spaces. And so we're told on page 99, after this long subterranean run, he comes out in what appears to be this sort of otherworldly garden. He came out in front of the sun, and brightness was everywhere. So after running through all this darkness, he comes out, and there's brightness everywhere. All kinds of spiky bushes were visible, blossoming with gemstones. So these are gemstones growing on plants. So clearly he's in another world, another realm. So the other side of this long tunnel, the tunnel of the sun, tunnel at the mountains at the end of the world, is a completely different world, and it's sort of as if he's gone through these mountains that the pillars of the earth in one of the Mesopotamian depictions of the flat world. He's gone through this cave, and at the other end, he's either gone around, maybe starting in the west and going to the east before the sun enters that cave and then goes back through, or he's just come to the edge of the human world. He's gone through this cave and come out in the world of the gods. Either way, it's the path of Shamash, the path of the sun. And so what he finds on the other side is different, but yet he sees some things that we would associate with the mortal world, like Siduri, the alewife. This woman sees Gilgamesh, sees that he's clad in a lion skin. She thinks he's an assassin, and so she bolts her door, and he says, open my door, and tells her who he is, and she can't believe it's him. She speaks to Gilgamesh, say, if you're truly Gilgamesh that struck down Humbaba, killed the lions in the mountain, seized the bull of heaven who came down from the sky and struck him, why are your cheeks wasted? Your face dejected, your heart so wretched, your appearance so worn, and grief in your innermost being. Your face is like that of a long-distance traveler. Your face is weathered by cold and heat. Clad only in a lion skin, you roam in open country. So she doesn't recognize him. She thinks he should look like a king and like someone who's 2/3 divine. And Gilgamesh speaks to her, to Siri the alewife. How could my cheeks not be washed, nor my face dejected, nor my heart wretched, nor my appearance worn out, nor grief in my innermost being, nor my face like that of a long-distant traveler, nor my face weathered by cold and heat, nor roaming in open country, clad only in a lion's skin? My friend, whom I love so much, who experienced every hardship with me, Enkidu, who I love so much, who experienced every hardship with me, that fate of mortals conquered him. 6 days and 7 nights I wept over him. I did not allow him to be buried until a worm fell out of his nose. I was frightened and afraid of death, and so I roam open country. He goes on, and this is on page 100 and 101, and you notice almost every one of those lines is in parentheses, meaning that almost every one of those lines is not readable on that part of the tablet. So how do they know, how does Stephanie Dalley know what to fill in on those brackets? Well, if you flip over to page 103, you see that the next column, column 3, that's what those 3 lowercase i's indicate, that we're on tablet 10, column 3. Column 3 is in much better shape, and we have the same refrain, except this time he's talking to Ur-Shanabi, the boatman. So this is after Siduri sends him on to Ur-Shanabi and says, he can take you to Utnapishtim. So this refrain helps us fill in a huge chunk, almost this entire column, relatively accurately, because he's saying the same things. The person he's approaching says, "This can't be Gilgamesh. He looks, his face is all worn. He's clad only in lion skins." And then his response is, "Well, how could I not be roaming in open country? How could I not look so worn? Because I've just lost my friend, and I've just sort of faced death, faced the reality of death." And this too could have been something that sounded, very poignant, not only for the content, for the emotion behind it, and the meaning that we can draw from it, but also as a song, as a chorus in a song. But notice, even though it's a refrain, even though it's repeated 3 times, because he says it also to Utnapishtim, when you hear it, you enjoy it when it's sung. Now, when you read it, you think, "Oh, I've read this already. He needs to come up with new things to say." But in a song, it makes perfect sense, and it sounds very, very poetic. So he goes through these channels, first to Siduri, and he tells his story. She says at first, "No, you can't." And okay, well, go to Ur-Shanabi. And Ur-Shanabi says, "No, I can't." Of course, with Ur-Shanabi, he kills these stone men that are the ones who row his boat. But after he kills these stone men, then Ur-Shanabi says, "Well, the only way we're going to be able to do this is if you go perform another labor and cut these poles." So again, he's able to do this, and Ur-Shanabi finally brings him to Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim, goes through the same refrain, saying, "How can this be Gilgamesh?" But also, this is the first time Ur-Shanabi has seen a mortal, apparently, since he was given immortality. And not only that, but Gilgamesh, who's been seeking him out, because Gilgamesh is looking for immortality, Utnapishtim and his wife are the only mortals ever to be granted immortality, so Gilgamesh is on this quest for immortality, and he's got to get it from Utnapishtim, so he does what monster slayers do. He wanted to get the cedars from Humbaba, so he fought and killed Humbaba. He wanted to protect Uruk from the Bull of Heaven, so he fought and killed the Bull of Heaven. And now he says to Utnapishtim, "I look at you, Utnapishtim, and your limbs are no different. You are just like me. Indeed, you are not at all different. You are just like me. I feel the urge to prove myself against you, to pick a fight." So it looked like he had in his head that he wanted to go fight with Utnapishtim. But this clearly isn't a quest that's going to be resolved with a fight. He's face to face with someone who's not the kind of person he's used to interacting with, not someone who's going to respond to force, either the way Enki responded to force, or the way the monsters responded to force, or the way the people of Uruk responded to force in the very beginning. He's got a whole new lesson to learn that he may not entirely be capable of learning at this point. So Utnapishtim, in order to try to help him understand the nature of mortality, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh his own story. His own story you may recognize as the story of Atrahasis. He's telling the story of Atrahasis because he is Atrahasis. In fact, the word or the name Atrahasis is used describing him within that story. When it's Ea or Enki talking to him or talking about him, that's when the word Atrahasis is actually used. So Utnapishtim, we learn, is Atrahasis. And this story, line by line, this narrative should be very familiar. If you keep your page marked on the beginning of tablet 11 on page 109, and then flip back and also look at page 29, which is tablet 3 of the Old Babylonian version of Atrahasis, you'll see some familiar lines. Tablet 3 of Atrahasis is missing its first 10 lines, but then down at the bottom you see the phrase that Enki is speaking to a wall. He says, "Wall, listen constantly to me. Read hut, make sure you attend all my words. Dismantle the house, build a boat. Reject possessions and save living things. The boat that you build," and then there's two missing lines, and then it says, "Roof it like the Apsu." So that's page 30 in Atrahasis. You flip back over to page 110 in Gilgamesh tablet 11, and you have Ea saying, read hut, brick wall, listen, read hut, pay attention, brick wall. Dismantle your house, build a boat, leave possessions, search out living things. Then you have lines that are there, and then roof it like the Apsu. So we can fill in, we can see that this is not only the same story, but almost the same narrative. Every time you tell a narrative or write a narrative separately, it's a different iteration, but it's a different iteration of what's pretty close to the same lines. And it's here in a completely different context. It served one purpose in Atrahasis, in that narrative, and in this one it serves a slightly different purpose. We leave out, tablet 11, Utnapishtim doesn't tell the story of the creation of humanity that we saw in the beginning of Atrahasis, doesn't tell the story of the Surupu disease, doesn't tell the story of the drought. It just starts with those lines about the flood. But the fact that he's telling this story within a different story makes this an example of what we'll call a frame narrative. Now, there's two easily confusable terms here that have to do with two parts of the same thing. One thing, the first term is narrative frame, and that is the context in which a framed narrative, a narrative within the narrative, is told. So the narrative frame here is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Utnapishtim talking to Gilgamesh, telling him why he's immortal, or the story about how he became immortal. Now, the narrative within that frame is the framed narrative, and that's the narrative told by the characters within the main narrative. So we have the same story taken out of its original context, put in a new context, and its original purpose seems to have been to educate people as to about the flood. But in this case, it's specifically one character educating another, namely educating Gilgamesh. So we keep this in mind as an example of the way stories are reused in different contexts. And it's easy to say, well, Atrahasis was the original version, was the text. But remember, even that was a redaction. Stephanie Dalley sort of had to redact the Old Babylonian version and the New Babylonian version. But even that has the indications that it came from oral tradition. So there were versions before that written version, and there were probably songs and stories going back centuries, if not, potentially millennia. So the myth might be more or less the same, but that's because, it has all these different versions. It's multiform. It has versions in which, for example, one thing that's changed in this iteration in the Utnapishtim's version of Tablet 12 is that when the flood comes and the gods are afraid and they think all of human beings have wiped out, in Gilgamesh Tablet 11, it's Ishtar. This is on page 113. Ishtar screamed like a woman giving birth. The mistress of the gods, sweet of voice, was wailing, and she said, quote, "Has the time really returned to clay? Because I spoke evil in the gods' assembly. How could I have spoken such evil in the gods' assembly? I should have ordered a battle to destroy my own people. I myself gave birth to them. They are my own people, and yet they fill the sea like fish spawn." End quote. So this is the same thing, essentially, that Nintu said in Atrahasis. Back on page 32, midwife of the gods, wise Mami, this is Belet Eli or Nintu, quotes, However could I, in the assembly of gods, have ordered such destruction with them? Enlil was strong enough to give a wicked order. So she blames him. She sees that human beings have been destroyed, and she's angry, and she's afraid that her own children are all dead. So this is an example of the same story, the same myth, given two different manifestations. Even though it's very close to line by line, it's still not exactly the same thing. And we call it multiform because the version in which Ishtar is the goddess who mourns the loss of humanity is much later. This, comes along in the Standard Babylonian version, and it doesn't seem that there was a flood version in the Old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. So we can pretty confidently say that Tablet 11 is a later version, but that doesn't mean that the Ishtar version is wrong and that the Nintu, Belit Ili, Mami version is right. These are both part of the same multiform. So we kind of respect each on its own terms, see that it's doing different things. And also we understand, or may understand, that Ishtar is more prominent now in the time that the Standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh is written than she was when the Old Babylonian version of Atrahasis was written. When the Old Babylonian version of Atrahasis was written, Belit Ili, Mami, Nintu was more prominent. But these narratives are parallel enough that they enable us to redact, to use one to sort of fill in what's missing in the other. And one of the things that we can fill in, actually there's a lot more here, there's a lot more of a description of the flood than we had in Atrahasis. But it also helps us figure out some lines that didn't make a lot of sense. Over on page 114, we have down toward the bottom the description of a sort of sacrifice. When Utnapishtim makes landfall, he says, I put everything out to the four winds. I made a sacrifice. I put the offering upon the mountain peak, arranged the jars 7 and 7. Into the bottom of them I poured the essences of reed, pine, and myrtle. The gods smelt the fragrance. The gods smelt the pleasant fragrance. The gods, like flies, gathered over the sacrifice. As soon as the mistress of the gods arrived, she raised great flies, which Anu made to please her. Behold, O gods, I shall never forget the significance of my lapis lazuli necklace. I shall remember these times and shall never forget. Let other gods come to the offering, but not Enlil, because he did not consult before imposing the flood. So that's Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh. Switch back to Tablet 3 of Atrahasis, page 33. We have that huge gap of 58 lines in column 4, and then in column 5 at the bottom of page 33, he put down something, provided food and a break, and then a line break, and then the gods smelt the fragrance, gathered like flies over the offering when they had eaten. And in this version, it's Nintu that got up and blamed them, and specifically called out Enlil for bringing about this catastrophe. Then she went up to the big flies which Anu had made and declared before the gods, his grief is mine, my destiny goes with him. He must deliver me from evil, appease me. So it's kind of, it's really ambiguous what any of that means, what this gods over the offering like flies. But the Utnapishtim version, Tablet 11, helps us figure out, okay, this is Utnapishtim's offering that he makes, and the gods need offerings from human beings. This is the reason they're all worried about human beings being wiped out. This is also why Ishtar, back in the Bull of Heaven incident, Anu tells her, you can't send the Bull of Heaven because there's something wrong with that. It'll wipe out the agriculture. And she says, no, it's okay. I've taken care that enough grain has been stored away. Not so much for the human benefit, but for the gods themselves. They need offerings from humans so much that they descend like flies over this burnt offering. So there's actually a burning of something, and that's thought to the smoke then sends it up to the gods, and the gods need that, so they gather over it. And in Tablet 11, before that, you probably saw some lines that looked very familiar that were not from Atrahasis. And that is at the top of page 114, when Utnapishtim is saying, when the 7th day of the flood arrived, I put out and released a dove. The dove went went out, it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned around. I put out and released a swallow. The swallow went, and it came back, for no perching place was visible to it, and it turned around. I put out a raven and released the raven. The raven went and saw the waters receding, and it ate, preened, lifted its tail, and did not turn around. So that passage, obviously, we'll come back to when we get to Genesis. So far, we've got these two narratives written 1,000 years apart, and we were able to piece together most of Atrahasis, at least the first two tablets, from the Old Babylonian version, occasionally supplemented by the Standard Babylonian version. Now, if we take Tablet 11 and go back to Atrahasis Tablet 3, we can actually put together a lot of the missing description of the flood narrative. But we remember that we are redacting. This is not as Atrahasis was written in its Old Babylonian version. This is our sort of next best guess. This is our redaction. It also helps us figure out why Enki was talking to a wall. He made a promise to Enlil that he wouldn't tell any humans, and technically he didn't tell a human. It just so happened while he was talking to this wall, which apparently belonged to Atrahasis, it was his house. But no, Enki wasn't talking, or Ea wasn't talking to Atrahasis, he was talking to the wall, and Atrahasis overheard him. And then, surprisingly, Enlil, who is still angry at everyone, and still seems to be hostile toward humanity at the end of Atrahasis, in the Utnapishtim version, he actually seems to relent. Says, Enlil came into the boat and seized my hand. Utnapishtim is speaking in the first person. Seized my hand and led me up. He led my woman and made her kneel down at my side. He touched our foreheads and stood between us, blessed us. Until now, Utnapishtim was mortal, but henceforth Utnapishtim and his woman shall be as we gods are. He shall dwell far off at the mouth of the rivers. So the purpose of this narrative within the Epic of Gilgamesh is to explain how immortality was bestowed on two mortals. But of course, it played a completely different purpose in its previous narrative context in Atrahasis. Unfortunately for Gilgamesh, the upshot of Utnapishtim's story is that immortality was only bestowed on mortals once, and it was because of this massive catastrophe that the gods felt bad about, and they were all gathered there together, and Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh, who's going to gather the gods together for you, that you may find eternal life which you seek. And he then tells him something curious. For a start, you must not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights. So it seems that, well, there might be a shot if you can stay awake. This connection between sleep and death we've seen before. And hey, this is the same guy who Shamhat told Enkidu before Enkidu had ever met Gilgamesh. Shamhat tells him Gilgamesh never sleeps, when she's talking about how fearsome he is and everything. He goes about like a raging bull, and he never sleeps. And Gilgamesh's mother, Ninsun, talks to Shamash, the god, and tells him, my son has a restless heart. And literally the Akkadian means a heart that does not sleep. So this guy who's described as never sleeping, whose heart never sleeps, as soon as Utnapishtim says you must not sleep for 6 days and 7 nights, as, quote, this is on 116, as soon as he was sitting with his head between his knees, sleep breathed over him like a fog. And Utnapishtim spoke to his wife, saying, look at the young man who wants eternal life. Sleep breathes over him like a fog. And his wife wants Utnapishtim to wake him up, but Utnapishtim says, no, let him sleep, but bake a loaf of bread every day he's asleep, because you know what's going to happen when he wakes up. He's going to say, oh, I just closed my eyes. I wasn't actually asleep. And when Gilgamesh finally does wake up, Utnapishtim points to all the 7 loaves of bread that have begun to mold, because one of them is 7 days old and one's 6 days old and so forth, to prove to him, yes, you have been asleep. You are mortal. You're not going to find immortality. But the next best thing he can do is say, there's this plant that can make you perpetually young, cause you to rejuvenate your youth, which Gilgamesh goes to find. And he finds it with Urshanabi's help. He says he's going to use this plant to cure a crisis. This is on page 119. With it, man may win the breath of life. I shall take it back to Uruk, the sheepfold. I shall give it to an elder to eat, and so try out the plant. Its name shall be An Old Man Grows into a Young Man. He's hoping to try this out on an older man and see if he becomes young again. And he goes to bathe in a pool, and while he's doing that, a snake comes along and eats the plant. And so the snake is able to shed its old skin and be young again. This is an etiology about why snakes shed their skin. The etiology, describing some natural phenomenon, and this is the first time it happened in their in the belief. So now, even that one thing taken away from them, there's nothing left for Gilgamesh. At the end of this Herculean quest, and I don't know if I can say that because Gilgamesh is probably older than Hercules, but after all these superhuman labors, he's got nothing to show for this quest for immortality. All he could do is go back to Uruk with Ur-Shanabi and tell him, look at the walls of Uruk. Look at the kingdom that I left behind in my quest for immortality. Gilgamesh spoke to him, to Ur-Shanabi, the boatman, quote, "Go up to the wall of Uruk, Ur-Shanabi, and walk around. Inspect the foundation platform and scrutinize the brickwork. Testify that its bricks are baked bricks, and that the seven counselors sent by Enki or Ea to help humans create civilization. The seven counselors must have laid its foundations. 1 square mile is city, 1 square mile is orchards, 1 square mile is clay pits, as well as the open ground of Ishtar's temple. 3 square miles in the open ground comprise Uruk." You've heard this before as well, not from Atrahasis or another text, but from the very beginning of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh, Tablet 1, I'm back on page 50, except it's not Gilgamesh speaking, or at least it doesn't seem to be. It's the narrator in the beginning after he has said, "Of he who found out all things I shall tell the land," or otherwise translated, "Of he who saw the deep I shall tell the land." He goes on to say, "He searched the lands everywhere, who experienced the whole, gained complete wisdom, found out what was secret and uncovered what was hidden, brought back a tale of times before the flood. He journeyed far and wide, weary at last resigned. He engraved his toils on a memorial monument of stone. He had the wall of Uruk built, the sheepfold of holiest Ayana, the pure treasury. See its wall like a copper band. Survey its battlements, which nobody else can match. Take the threshold, which is from time immemorial. Approach Ayana, the temple, the home of Ishtar, which no future king nor any man will ever match." And here we go with those lines that begin and end the epic. "Go up to the wall of Uruk and walk around. Inspect the foundation platform and scrutinize the brickwork. Testify its bricks are baked bricks, and that the seven counselors must have laid its foundation." The same lines that Gilgamesh says to Ur-Shanabi, the narrator is saying to his audience. And his audience for the standard Babylonian version is listening in the 7th or 6th century BC. This is 1,000 years after the old Babylonian version, and 2,000 years after the historical Gilgamesh would have lived. And still he can point to the walls of Uruk and say, look, that's them. Gilgamesh didn't achieve immortality by not dying, but he achieved immortality by those walls. And we can sort of say the same thing. 4,500 years after the historical Gilgamesh, we know that these walls, or at least the original walls, were built by this king who the Babylonian king list, or the Sumerian king list refer to as Gilgamesh. So in a way, this is an achievement of immortality, but it's the only kind of immortality that mortals can achieve. It is through the works, through what they do when they're here. And this seems to be the sort of the lesson that Gilgamesh learns at the very end, and potentially the lesson that we're all supposed to learn when we hear the story, that you're not, no matter how powerful you are, you're not going to defeat death. But what you do in life, you have the opportunity to build something that could last for, maybe forever, maybe for, well beyond your own biological lifetime. So the Epic of Gilgamesh doesn't tell us about how the walls of Uruk were built. Presumably they were there in the beginning when whatever else he was doing, all the immature and bullyish way that Gilgamesh was acting in the beginning. Presumably he had already built the walls, but Gilgamesh has changed. He has gone from being that sort of narcissistic, egotistical bully to being someone who is proud of, only now proud of what he's done for other people. And so this is what we mean by a character arc. There's the way the character starts, there are the characteristics of that character at the beginning, and after going through this conflict and having to explore his or her own potential, sort of realizing that potential, or interacting with this conflict will change that character in a way that may or may not have anything to do with the intended goal. There's a difference between what we call an ultimate goal and a proximate goal. A proximate goal is the thing you think you want, the thing that you're focused on, but the ultimate goal is what actually happens through chasing that proximate goal. So you might think of lifting weights as a proximate goal. You're trying to lift one weight one time, but even if you just put it right back where you found it, you have sort of changed yourself in doing that. So we have this character arc, and this representation of that arc comes from Thorkild Jacobsen in an essay called And Death, the Journey's End. And it's not exactly an arc, but this is kind of how we can conceive of the arc. Actually, he does have that arc, the flight from reality changing into flight to reality. But it also may look a little bit like Freytag's pyramid. There's this, escalating conflict, and then this, something happens at this climax and this falling action. But in this case, it's actually Gilgamesh's aspirations that go from, fighting Enkidu to, joining up with Enkidu and fighting Humbaba, then fighting the Bull of Heaven, and then he comes sort of crashing back down to earth. His self-estimation comes crashing back down to earth when he realizes that he is not immortal, that he could die just like Enkidu. And so he gets, back on the hero's road by going all the way to this other world. But even though he accomplishes more and more and more, he eventually has to come back down when he returns to Uruk, having lost. But in the end, this recognition that his walls are his immortality is elevated from where he was at the beginning, when he was this sort of childish, brutish, a problem for the people that he was supposed to be the helper of. So ending with the same words that describe the walls of Uruk, the exact same refrain for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, or what would have been 6 lines in the on the tablet, seems like the perfect ending, perfect sort of way to wrap up and end where we began and sort of close this frame. And yet, there's a whole other tablet. Now, what are we to do with tablet 12? Not only does this seem to carry on a story that seems to be pretty well over, but it also, we have a return of Enkidu. It doesn't seem that he's ever actually died. He's just sort of described as being alive, as if nothing had ever happened. In fact, the first lines of tablet 12 aren't broken. It just starts with, "If only I had the puku in the carpenter's house today." The puku, remember from the very beginning, was this sort of like a baseball bat or something like that they played a game with. "Today the puku fell into the earth and my meku fell into the earth." No continuity whatsoever from tablet 11. And if you sort of read through this, you see that Enkidu is alive, and yet he goes down to retrieve these things that have fallen down into the earth, and when he's there, he ends up in the world of the dead. And he looks around and describes the world of the dead in terms that are sort of similar to the way he described them in book 7. At least what he's describing is similar, but it seems like it comes from a very different narrative. And if you're wondering how does this fit in, well, it really doesn't. It's a good indication that this is the product of a redaction. Tablet 12 was sort of added on to the Epic of Gilgamesh, even though we wouldn't really say it's part of the epic. Tablet 12 is actually one of those, or at least very close to one of those individual Gilgamesh narratives I mentioned at the last lecture that was commissioned by King Shulgi around the year 2150 BCE. So a millennium and a half before the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. And there were, what we have with us today, there are 7 of them. And there are 6 of them, and then I'm going to mention one other text here that's not a Gilgamesh text. But there are there's a Sumerian version called Gilgamesh and the Halub tree, which is also called Gilgamesh and the Netherworld. And this seems to be, at some point, a source text for Tablet 12. Then there's a tablet telling the story of Gilgamesh and Humbaba, who in the Sumerian is called Huwawa. That is very close to the description of the fight of Gilgamesh and Enkidu against Humbaba. Then there's Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven. Again, this is very similar to an element of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then there's the death of Gilgamesh. Well, clearly we don't have that. We didn't get to any point where Gilgamesh died. The flood tablet, I mentioned before, there is the Ziusudra Sumerian flood tablets. This is one of those. Not Atrahasis. This is in a different language than Atrahasis. But and then we have the descent of Inanna or Ishtar into the underworld. And this is very close to what a text that you have in Myths from Mesopotamia, which is called the Descent of Ishtar. And in that story, we actually have the rest of the story. If you remember, when Gilgamesh is insulting Ishtar, he says that you left your consort, your lover Tammuz, to be trapped in the underworld. And she actually, this is a story of her relationship with a god named Dumuzi or Tammuz, which she tries to go down to the underworld to ask her sister Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, to let him go, and she refuses. Very similar to what we have happen in this in Tablet 12 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And then we have Gilgamesh and Aga or Akka, the king of Kish, who was another historical king, and very likely this tablet represents a battle between the kingdom of Uruk and the kingdom of Kish. So notice how some of these tablets fit. The story of Gilgamesh and Humbaba, the story of Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven. These things work well in the epic, and also this story about going down to the underworld to try to get your close companion back. And we have the flood story that works well. Now it's not the flood narrative is about Atrahasis, and it's told by Utnapishtim Atrahasis, so it fits. We understand why it's in there. Utnapishtim has to tell Gilgamesh the story so that Gilgamesh understands why he, Utnapishtim, is immortal, but also why he, Gilgamesh, can never be immortal. So it fits, even though it's kind of a digression. But then Tablet 12 just doesn't seem to fit at all. And that leads us to ask, why is this here? If it doesn't do a very good job of telling this complete story. And it seems to have been there because people thought that this is something that's very important, even though it doesn't fit the story. It has a ritual importance. It's a description of the underworld. It's a description of the world of the dead, the world that we're all going to have to go to after death. So it's something that needs to be preserved as well, even if it doesn't fit within that story. We have an incident in 705 BCE. Another copy was made of Tablet 12 by this priest or scribe named Nabu Zukupkinu, who copied down the 12th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh in order to use it to help the people of Babylon interpret the death of Sargon II, to perhaps be part of his funeral ritual or something to that effect. So it had its own use. Clearly that use has sort of dropped off. It's not something that we really need to interpret this text, but we recognize that for somebody, this text needed to be part of the Epic of Gilgamesh. For some reason that's maybe lost to us, and a reason that has led other translators in more popular versions of Gilgamesh to just completely leave off Tablet 12, or to try to integrate it earlier when Enkidu has this dream that he's going to die. That's frequently where modern redactors, translators who also redact the story, and to try to make it more coherent, to try to make it fit our sense of the progression of a story, what needs to happen. It doesn't work as the sort of appendix in our modern sensibility, but this is the way it was transcribed in the Standard Babylonian version, and this is the way that I wanted you to read it, so that you come to that realization on your own, that this doesn't fit. This was added later. It doesn't mean it's unimportant, because clearly it was so important that it needed to be preserved, even though it didn't fit. So even though it doesn't make for easy reading, it does help us to understand how narratives work. And that is more important than the story by itself for our purposes here. Remember that we've got a historical king Gilgamesh. We've got a historical victory over the kingdom of Kish that leads to the expansion of the city of Uruk, makes it the most successful city for centuries after Gilgamesh's life. Gilgamesh is credited with building these walls, and his sort of legend of his physical prowess and victories on the battlefield and all this carry on. But remember, he also has this religious tradition in which he is the Saint Peter of their underworld. He's this judge in the underworld that people will see again, if they accomplish great deeds in their life, or if they, follow the sort of religious ritual prescriptions that people are supposed to follow in their lifetime. They'll see Gilgamesh in the underworld. And those traditions might travel separately. They might be, in the priest will be focused on the fact that Gilgamesh is in the underworld, whereas the common people and the kings might be focused on the legends and the stories about his accomplishments on the battlefield, or fighting monsters, or even having to come to terms with his own mortality. And as those sources, those independent traditions recombine, sometimes they recombine smoothly, like the story of Humbaba and the story of the Bull of Heaven. They fit pretty well into that story. Sometimes they don't fit so smoothly. Sometimes there are these seams, as if these stories have been stitched together, and we can see the stitches are still visible. Sometimes there are these doublets, and this seems to be what's happened between Tablet 12. Tablet 7 and Tablet 12 seem to have similar stories to tell. Both involve Enkidu in the underworld, describing what the underworld is like, but clearly they're not the same thing. And in that instance, the redactor chose to keep them separate and just stick the Tablet 12 on the end. So I hope you're able to sort of piece together basically what's happened. And if you've read another version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, or listened to an audiobook or something like that, that's totally great. But what I do want you to remember is how this story was sort of stitched together. Just like with Atrahasis, and the fact that Atrahasis has been stitched into this story. This is how narratives work over a long period of time. They can maintain a certain fidelity for thousands of years, as we see when we have some of the exact same lines from the old Babylonian version of Atrahasis and the standard Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. They can maintain some consistency over time, but we also see these changes, and we see this deliberate redaction where the redactor has to decide, what do I do with this? Do I let it go, or do I keep it here, even if it doesn't make very much sense? And if I conjoin these narratives, do I need to make them coherent, or is it okay to leave them separate? Remember what the king Shulgi, who commissioned these earliest Sumerian Gilgamesh narratives, said. He bragged about the fact that he did not forget tradition, that he did not ignore any of the stories that came to him. He wanted them all written down, but even if they don't quite fit together in a coherent pattern. So if you're interested in writing for your paper about the Epic of Gilgamesh, or if you're just interested in Gilgamesh in general, here's some additional resources you might be interested in. I give you 2 links, and by the way, you don't have to type all these out there. The links are in Blackboard as well. But if you want to learn more about that specific flood tablet, the British Museum Tablet 11 flood tablet is the most complete version of the story. I'll give you a couple of links to information about that. If you're interested in the pantheon of the gods and goddesses of the Mesopotamians, the University of Pennsylvania has put together a nice guide to that. There's a nice documentary. It's about a half an hour on the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which modern writers kind of describe what they like about the epic and the themes and that sort of thing. But it's a good example of appropriating something from another story, another culture, and putting it in our own modern terms. So they don't tend to realize they're doing it, but they're actually doing what the Cambridge students did in Frederick Bartlett's study. They're kind of putting in some modern concepts back into the epic. But it's interesting to see how creative writers do that. The 2 best books about Gilgamesh, about the background of the the text are The Evolution of the Gilgamesh Epic by Jeffrey T. Gay and The Buried Book by David Damrosch. And Damrosch's book is mostly about the archaeology of the tablets, but the last 3 or 4 chapters are about Gilgamesh itself and give a lot of the backstory. And I also mentioned that book, When They Severed Earth from Sky, How the Human Mind Shapes Myth, by the folklore researchers Elizabeth Wayland Barber and Paul T. Barber. So next, speaking of floods, we move on to Genesis. I have posted on Blackboard a PDF with the New Oxford Annotated Bible, the New Revised Standard Version. I know everybody has a Bible at home, and the reason I've included this is, for one, it's got a lot of additional material that's going to be relevant to us. It's got 2 essays that are going to describe the way the scholarship, biblical scholarship of the last 150 years, so that you'll know what I'm talking about when I refer to the J source or the P source in Genesis. Those are going to be very important. Read those essays first, and then read this version. Even if you've got your own version, read this version. I'm not assigning the notes at the bottom, but the notes are very helpful if you're trying to figure out how some of these passages fit together or were fitted together. So use this. This is the one I'm going to be using in the next lecture. And definitely read over those essays. You're going to read first the first 11 books of Genesis, and then we're going to move on to the rest of Genesis. I'm probably going to shorten that second reading for next week. Because it's like 80 pages, and I'm going to try to cut that down. But you're going to read in their entirety the first 11 books of Genesis for the later part of this week.